There is a moment in every band's life when the world finally begins to open up. After years of playing cramped clubs, hauling gear through back doors, and wondering if anyone outside the Midwest would ever know their name, the dream suddenly feels real. For REO Speedwagon, that moment came after more than a decade of hard nights, lineup changes, and endless miles on the road. They climbed slowly, step by step, until the top no longer felt impossible. And when they finally got there, when their songs filled radios across the country and their faces appeared on MTV, it seemed like nothing could ever bring them down. But the climb is only half the story. What almost no one prepares for is the moment when the world shifts beneath your feet, when the success you worked so hard for begins to fade. And when the band you built your life around no longer feels like the same band at all. For REO Speedwagon, that flip was painful. And for Gary Richrath, the fiery guitarist whose sound helped define the band's identity, it changed everything. Gary was the hometown kid turned rock star, the force who pushed the band musically through the 70s and led them into their greatest era in the early 80s. But fame is a fragile thing. As the decade began to wind down and the music world changed around them, the band that once seemed unstoppable found itself drifting toward a breakup that no one wanted, but everyone felt coming. Before we continue, let me know in the comments which REO song first introduced you to the band. And if you enjoy deep dive rock documentaries, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to Band History. The early years. REO Speedwagon began like so many great American rock bands do, not in a glamorous studio or a smoky Los Angeles club, but in a college basement in Champaign, Illinois. Neil Dowdy and Alan Gratzer were just two students who liked making noise together. No one watching them in those early days would have guessed they were laying the groundwork for one of the biggest rock bands of the next decade. They were young, hungry, and full of the kind of stubborn belief only musicians have. The belief that maybe this thing that they were building could actually go somewhere. But even with all their passion, the early band was missing something. Their shows were loud, their energy was real, yet they still felt like a good local band instead of a great one. That changed in 1970 when a young guitarist from Peoria walked into the picture. His name was Gary Richrath, and the moment he plugged in, everything shifted. Gary didn't just play guitar, he attacked it. His tone, his stage presence, the way he carried himself, all of it screamed rock star, even when he was standing in a half-empty club. But the most important thing he brought was something REO desperately needed: original songs. Gary wanted in as badly as the band wanted him, and from the first rehearsal, it felt like a spark had been lit. Suddenly the band had direction. They had identity. They had someone pushing them forward with a fire that made everyone else step up. Fans who saw them in those early years almost always said the same thing. Gary was the guy you couldn't take your eyes off. The early 70s were also filled with constant changes at the microphone. Terry Luttrell left, Kevin Cronin came in, Kevin left, and Mike Murphy took over for several albums. The band kept moving forward, but the chemistry still wasn't perfect. Then, in 1976, everything clicked when Kevin Cronin returned. His voice, combined with Gary's guitar, created the sound REO had been chasing for years. Add Neil on keyboards, Alan on drums, and the final piece, Bruce Hall replacing bassist Greg Philbin in 1977, and REO Speedwagon finally felt complete. Night after night, they tore through the Midwest, winning fans the hard way. They weren't a radio band yet. They weren't a household name. But if you saw them live in those days, you walked out knowing you had witnessed something real, something raw, something coming. By the end of the 70s, REO Speedwagon wasn't just surviving, they were building momentum. One sweaty show and one long highway at a time. They were no longer the college band from Champaign. They were becoming the REO Speedwagon fans would soon know across the country. Building momentum. By the mid-1970s, REO Speedwagon was no longer just a hungry young band hoping for a break. They had survived lineup changes, long nights on the road, and the constant uphill battle of trying to prove themselves in a rock landscape dominated by giants. Bands like Aerosmith, Kiss, Boston, and Leonard Skinner were filling arenas with fireworks, spectacle, and massive production budgets. REO, on the other hand, was still doing things the old way, traveling from town to town in cramped vans, hauling their own gear, and playing as if every show could be the one that made or broke them. It was not glamorous. It was not comfortable. But the grind gave them something the bigger bands did not always have: hunger. Gary Richrath especially embodied this hunger. By this point, he had become the band's musical engine, the person who pushed them hardest behind the scenes. He wrote constantly. He wanted the band to sound heavier, tighter, more confident. He wanted them to feel like a real rock act. When he stepped on stage, he played like a man who knew he had something to prove. Fans who saw them during this period often talk about how Gary dominated the stage, even without trying. He moved with a kind of raw, natural energy that made it impossible to take your eyes off him. He looked like a rock star long before REO was treated like one. Touring became the band's greatest strength. Night after night, they won fans the old-fashioned way. People who walked into small clubs to see them walked out wondering how a band this good was not already famous nationwide. Word spread slowly, but it spread consistently. And behind that growing reputation was Gary's guitar, Kevin Cronin's developing songwriting, Alan Gratzer's steady drumming, Neil Doughty's melodic lines, and the increasingly tight presence of Bruce Hall on bass. Every piece of the machine was working harder than ever. The band released several albums during these years, and although none of them exploded commercially, each one helped define the shape of what REO Speedwagon was becoming. This period was a slow burn, the kind of rise that feels invisible until suddenly it is impossible to ignore. Their fans became fiercely loyal, especially in the Midwest. Cities like Peoria, Champaign, Omaha, Cedar Rapids, and St. Louis began treating REO like hometown heroes. They were the Midwest's band, one of the few groups who felt like they truly came from the same neighborhoods as the people who filled their shows. It was during this time that the band released the live album that changed everything. You Get What You Play For, released in 1977, was the first clear sign that REO had something powerful on their hands. Unlike their studio records, which often struggled to capture the intensity of their live performance, this album showed the world the version of REO their fans already knew. The version that tore up stages, fed off crowds, and played with a gritty confidence that could not be faked. People who had never heard REO Speedwagon suddenly understood what the excitement was about. Critics who had dismissed them began to admit that the band, at the very least, had earned their reputation through sheer force of will. But perhaps most importantly, the album sold well. It did not go multi-platinum or dominate the charts, but it made enough noise to convince the industry that REO Speedwagon might be more than just a regional act. And inside the band, it gave them a kind of renewed purpose. They were tired of being the group that worked harder than everyone else without getting the recognition. They wanted their shot. They wanted their hit record. They wanted the moment where everything they had endured finally paid off. Gary Richrath wanted it more than anyone. For him, music was not just a career choice. It was a mission, a personal calling. People close to the band during that time often said he lived and breathed every note he played. When the band was rehearsing, Gary pushed everyone. When they were writing, Gary pushed himself. When they were on stage, Gary played like it was his last chance to make it. That intensity defined both the best and the hardest parts of REO Speedwagon's journey. It drove them toward greatness, but it also created tensions that would eventually shape the band's future in ways nobody could see coming. Even as the band worked tirelessly, the music industry continued to move around them. Disco was exploding, punk was rising, arena rock was becoming bigger and more polished. Many bands with less talent but better timing were getting opportunities REO had been chasing for years. Still, the band kept going. They kept touring. They kept writing. And slowly, the pressure built towards something that felt like a breakthrough waiting to happen. They did not know when it would come. They did not know how it would look, but they could feel it coming. The energy in the band shifted. The determination grew stronger. And they entered the studio in 1978 with a sense of purpose they had never felt before. What came out of that period was the album titled, "You Can Tune a Piano, But You Can't Tune a Fish." The title was quirky enough to catch attention, but the music inside was what truly mattered. It became one of the band's best-selling albums up to that time and marked the first real nationwide recognition REO Speedwagon had ever received. Songs like "Roll with the Changes" and "Time for Me to Fly" became staples of their live shows and remain classics to this day. This was the moment when the pieces finally fit together, and REO Speedwagon stepped out of the shadows and onto the national rock stage. Before we move on to the years when the band's success would explode beyond anything they had ever imagined, take a moment to tell me this in the comments. Have you ever seen REO Speedwagon live, whether in the 70s, 80s, or even in recent years? I would love to know what memories stand out for you. Hi Infidelity and the peak years. By the time the new decade arrived, REO Speedwagon was no longer just a touring rock band hoping for a breakthrough. They had been building momentum through the second half of the 70s, slowly gaining a reputation for their live shows and the tight chemistry of their classic lineup. The years of grinding on the road had sharpened them into a band that could deliver night after night, and the release of "You Can Tune a Piano, But You Can't Tune a Fish" in 1978 finally pushed them into the national spotlight. Songs like "Roll with the Changes" and "Time for Me to Fly" gave them traction, but they were still one big album away from becoming a household name. That moment came in the winter of 1980 with the release of Hi Infidelity, the album that would change everything for the band. No one could have predicted the scale of its success. Even inside the band, there was a sense that they had made something strong, something focused, something that captured the chemistry they had worked so hard to build. But the reaction from the public was beyond anything they expected. Hi Infidelity climbed to #1 on the Billboard charts and stayed there long enough to become one of the most successful rock albums of the entire decade. It went on to sell more than 10 million copies in the United States alone, turning REO Speedwagon into one of the most recognizable bands in America. The success of the album rested heavily on the unique partnership of Kevin Cronin and Gary Richrath. Kevin brought strong melodies and heartfelt lyrics, while Gary delivered the emotional power and musical edge that kept REO grounded in rock. The two did not always agree, but their differences created the balance that gave Hi Infidelity its unmistakable sound. Keep On Loving You became the band's first #1 single.
You should have known by the tone of my voice.
Blending Kevin's emotional delivery with Gary's unmistakable guitar tone. Take It on the Run, one of Gary's most enduring compositions, showcased the raw honesty and urgency that had always defined his writing. Without Gary's playing, both songs would have leaned further toward pop. But with him, they became essential rock tracks that resonated with millions. Just as the band was reaching new heights, something else happened, something that would multiply their fame overnight. On August 1st, 1981, MTV launched. No one knew whether the channel would survive, but it introduced a new era where visuals mattered almost as much as music. In the first 24 hours of MTV's existence, REO Speedwagon had 8 videos in rotation. For a band that had spent most of its life winning over audiences through relentless touring, this was an unexpected and enormous shift. Suddenly, people across the country saw their faces, their performances, and the energy that had always defined their concerts. The timing could not have been better. MTV needed content, and REO needed exposure. Within a week, the band's sold-out show in Denver became one of the earliest REO concert broadcasts on the new channel. Fans who had never seen REO live now felt connected to the band, and Hi Infidelity benefited enormously from this visibility. The record stayed hot for months, and the band found themselves on stages bigger than anything they had imagined during their early days. But success has a way of creating pressure, and the aftermath of Hi Infidelity was no exception. The band suddenly faced the impossible expectation of repeating what they had just achieved. The follow-up album, Good Trouble, released in 1982, performed well and produced singles that kept the band on the charts, but it could not escape the shadow of its predecessor. Fans liked it, critics respected it. But it was clear that Hi Infidelity had set a bar that no one album could match. Still, the band pressed on. They continued touring heavily and returned to the studio for another album. Wheels Are Turnin', released in 1984, included Can't Fight This Feeling, a ballad that became one of the biggest songs of their career. It was proof that REO Speedwagon still had the ability to produce hits even after the enormous success of their earlier work. The band remained a major live attraction through the mid-'80s, and their music videos continued to find a home on MTV. Yet, underneath the success, subtle changes were occurring. The music world was shifting toward highly produced pop rock and synth-driven sounds. Bands were expected to adapt, and REO was no exception. Kevin Cronin embraced the role of guiding the band toward the kind of polished sound that kept them commercially relevant. Gary Richrath, however, struggled with this shift. He believed deeply in the guitar-driven rock that defined REO's early years, and he did not want to see the band drift too far toward radio-friendly softness. These artistic differences did not explode into open conflict, but they created a quiet tension that became harder to ignore as the decade progressed. The band could still deliver hits, they could still fill venues, but behind the scenes, the creative unity that had powered their rise was beginning to fade. The cracks did not destroy the band immediately, but they marked the beginning of a slow change, one that would eventually reshape everything REO Speedwagon had built. Decline and conflict. As the mid-1980s arrived, REO Speedwagon found themselves in a strange position. They were still a major name, still touring successfully, and still releasing music that reached the charts. But underneath the surface, the ground was shifting in ways the band could not completely control. The world around them was changing fast. Synths and polished production were becoming more important than guitars. MTV wanted clean images and carefully crafted videos. Radio was leaning toward ballads, pop rock, and highly produced singles. REO Speedwagon, a band born out of the gritty Midwest rock scene, suddenly had to exist in a much different musical landscape. For Kevin Cronin, adapting to these changes felt necessary. He understood where mainstream rock was heading, and he felt a responsibility to guide the band into a modern sound that could survive the decade. Kevin's songwriting had always leaned toward melody and emotional narratives, and the 80s rewarded exactly that style. But for Gary Richrath, this shift was painful. He believed deeply in the rock and roll identity that had defined REO through the 70s. To him, the band's soul was found in loud guitars, honest energy, and the kind of raw passion that no amount of studio polish could recreate. Watching the music drift towards softer production and radio-friendly arrangements felt like losing part of what made the band real. This difference in vision did not begin with shouting matches or dramatic confrontations. It began quietly, in rehearsal rooms, in studio discussions, and during long stretches on the road. What had once felt like a partnership now felt like a tug-of-war between two very different ideas of what REO Speedwagon should be. At first, the tension was manageable. They had made it through tougher times. But by 1984 and 1985, the strain became harder to ignore. Even as Wheels Are Turnin' produced another chart-topping hit with Can't Fight This Feeling, some members could sense that the spark inside the band was starting to dim. Recording their next album made the cracks even more visible. The band released Life as We Know It in 1987, the final album to feature the classic lineup. Fans enjoyed the new music, and the band still toured heavily, but behind the scenes it was clear the chemistry was not the same. The creative process had become more complicated. Everyone felt the pressure to deliver more hits, yet the winds of the industry were blowing in directions that did not align with what Gary felt comfortable playing. The more the band leaned toward melodic and polished material, the more Gary felt disconnected from what REO was becoming. Meanwhile, Alan Gratzer, the band's original drummer and one of its founding members, had quietly been feeling the weight of the years. REO Speedwagon had consumed his entire adult life. He had spent 2 decades on tour buses in recording studios and on stages across the world. He had lived through the early struggles, the slow climb, the breakthrough, and the years at the top. But by 1988, he was tired. He later said that what began as something fun eventually took over every corner of their lives. He wanted to go home, raise his family, and start a new chapter that did not revolve around the band's constant demands. When Alan announced he was leaving, it shocked everyone, even those who sensed he had been unhappy. Kevin, Neil, and Bruce understood why he wanted to walk away, but the emotional impact was still huge. For Gary Richrath, it was devastating. Alan had been there since day one. He had been through every version of REO Speedwagon, through bad crowds and great crowds, through the failures and the victories. When Gary hugged him goodbye and broke down in tears, it showed just how deeply the original members were connected. Alan's departure did not just remove a drummer from the lineup, it removed a vital piece of the band's heart. After Alan left, REO felt different. The foundation they had relied on for so long was no longer intact. The remaining members kept working and tried to push forward, but it was clear things were changing, and they were changing fast. The disagreements between Kevin and Gary became harder to avoid. The band's direction became an ongoing debate rather than a shared vision. Gary felt the music drifting too far from rock. Kevin felt the band needed to adapt or be left behind. Both believed they were doing what was best. Both were right in their own way. But they could not agree, and the tension continued building. By the end of 1988, the band stood at a crossroads. They had reached the top, but the peak years were behind them. The industry was evolving into something new, and REO was trying to hold on to what they had built while facing the reality that change was unavoidable. The unity that once carried them through every challenge was starting to fracture, and for the first time, the idea that the classic lineup might not survive began to feel real. The breaking point and Gary's departure. Alan Gratzer's departure in 1988 marked a turning point for REO Speedwagon. For most fans, it looked like a simple lineup change, but inside the band, it was far more emotional. Alan had been there from the beginning, through the early struggles, long drives, tiny clubs, and the slow climb towards success. Losing him meant losing a stabilizing presence, a friend, and a piece of the original chemistry that had carried the band for 2 decades. Kevin Cronin, Neil Doughty, and Bruce Hall understood why Alan wanted to step away, but for Gary Richrath, it was a heartbreaking moment. When Alan told the band he was done, Gary hugged him and broke down in tears. It was one of the clearest signs that the old foundation of REO Speedwagon was beginning to crumble. After Alan left, the balance inside the band shifted. The creative tension between Kevin and Gary, which had simmered quietly for years, became harder to ignore. Kevin believed that REO needed to continue adapting to the polished, radio-friendly sound of the 80s. He felt that the band's best path forward was to write songs that kept them on the charts and on MTV. Gary, however, felt the band was drifting away from its rock roots. He wanted a sound driven by guitars, emotion, and energy, the sound that had built their reputation in the 70s. What once made them a strong creative team now became a growing divide. They were fighting for 2 different versions of REO Speedwagon, and neither side wanted to surrender what they believed was right. As the 80s wore on, this artistic tug-of-war strained the band's unity. Their album, Life as We Know It, released in 1987, would end up being the last to feature the classic lineup. The music was strong, but the sessions behind it were difficult. Everyone felt pressure, and the chemistry that once defined the group was fading. The creative process felt heavier, and the sense of shared purpose that pushed them through their biggest years was slipping away. By 1989, it had become clear that REO Speedwagon could not continue in the same form. The breaking point finally came when the band confronted their future. Kevin saw a path where REO leaned into melodic songwriting and adult contemporary success. Gary saw a path where the band reclaimed the heavier sound that first made them unique. But the truth was, neither direction could return them to the glory days of Hi Infidelity. Rock music had changed, and the era of REO dominating the charts was simply over. Even Gary's vision of a return to raw rock and roll could not compete with the rising wave of grunge, alternative rock, and blues-influenced bands. The band's time at the top had passed, and nothing could bring that era back. In 1990, Gary Richrath left REO Speedwagon. It was not a dramatic public breakup, but a slow, sad realization that the band he helped build no longer felt like home. His departure ended the creative partnership that had fueled their greatest achievements. And for Gary, leaving was more than a career change. It was an emotional loss that followed him for the rest of his life. REO moved forward with new members and recorded an album without Gary or Alan. Epic Records, their label for nearly 20 years, dropped them soon after. Without the classic lineup, the band struggled to find its footing. Gary moved on and formed his own band, simply called Richrath. He returned to the guitar-driven rock he believed in and played clubs and smaller venues throughout the Midwest. Fans who loved the old REO sound appreciated seeing him again, but the era had passed. His album sold poorly, even more poorly than the REO album Epic had rejected. It was a painful reminder that talent does not always guarantee success once the spotlight moves on. Before we move into the next chapter, where Gary tried to rebuild while REO redefined itself without him, tell me in the comments what you think was the true turning point: Alan's departure, the musical direction, or the pressures of the industry. And if you're enjoying this documentary, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to Band History. Two paths: Gary's struggles and REO's new reality. When Gary Richrath left REO Speedwagon, he walked away from more than just a band. He walked away from the life he had built for 20 years, from the music that had defined him, and from the audience that once saw him as the heart of the group. After leaving, Gary formed a new band simply called Richrath, and he returned to the style of music he always loved: loud guitars, emotional solos, classic rock energy. He poured his heart into the project, and the band played clubs, theaters, and outdoor festivals throughout the Midwest. Fans who missed the old REO sound loved seeing him again, and even in small venues, Gary played with the same fire he had in the 70s. But the crowds were smaller, the money was limited, and the industry was changing faster than any bar band could keep up with. Gary never stopped giving everything he had on stage, but the world around him had moved on. Meanwhile, Kevin Cronin, Neil Doughty, and Bruce Hall continued under the REO Speedwagon name. They hired new players, kept touring, and leaned into the nostalgia market, performing the hits that fans still loved. The REO name carried weight, and even without Gary and Alan, the band found steady work playing the songs that had once filled arenas. Some fans criticized them for continuing without the classic members. Others were simply happy to hear those songs performed live. But inside the band, there was an understanding that a full reunion with Gary was unlikely. Too much distance had grown, too many wounds remained, and Gary's health, habits, and emotional state were not always stable enough for a comeback. The 90s became a decade of two parallel stories. Gary fought to keep making music on his own terms, even when the world did not pay attention. And the remaining members of REO fought to keep the band's legacy alive, even when it meant acknowledging that their greatest era was behind them. Both paths carried their own forms of sadness. Both paths carried their own forms of pride. And both paths showed how complicated it becomes when the dream you chased for half a lifetime finally slips into the past. What could have been and what never was. As the years passed, fans continued to hope for a full reunion. There were whispers, rumors, and moments when it seemed possible. A classic lineup tour would have been huge. The money would have been enormous. And the emotional payoff would have been even bigger. But it never happened. Alan Gratzer had retired from music completely, choosing family and a quieter life over the chaos of touring. Gary wanted the reunion, at least at times, but his health and personal struggles made it difficult. Kevin, Neil, and Bruce kept the band alive on the road, but the version of REO that fans dreamed of, Gary on guitar, Kevin on vocals, Neil on keys, Alan on drums, and Bruce on bass, never appeared again. Gary continued performing when he could, but the years took a toll. The long nights, the emotional battles, the changes in the industry, and the difficulty of moving on from REO all weighed heavily on him. Even so, whenever he stepped on stage, you could still see flashes of the man who once helped define a generation of rock fans. The fire never fully left him. It just lived in a smaller, quieter world. REO Speedwagon's story is one of huge success, painful endings, and the complicated truth that even the greatest musical partnerships cannot always survive the passage of time. The band reached heights few groups ever experienced, but the fall was harder for some members than others. Gary Richrath's journey became a reminder that being a rock star is not just about fame. It is about identity, purpose, and the struggle to hold on to something that once meant everything. Before we wrap up this story, let me know in the comments what your favorite REO Speedwagon era was and which song you think best represents the band's legacy. And if you enjoyed this deep dive documentary, please like this video and subscribe to Band History for more long-form rock stories that keep the past alive. The story of REO Speedwagon is a reminder that every rise comes with a cost, and every fall carries its own kind of truth. They were a band built on hard work, long nights, and the stubborn belief that music could take a group of Midwestern kids somewhere they never expected to go. And it did. They reached the top. They left behind songs that still play on radios, at concerts, and in memories all across the world. Yet behind those unforgettable melodies were friendships tested, dreams reshaped, and a guitarist whose fire never dimmed even when the spotlight moved away. Gary Richrath's journey remains one of rock's most powerful and bittersweet stories. He gave everything he had to REO Speedwagon, and whether the world noticed it or not, the band's greatest moments were born from the sound he carried in his hands. Time may have moved on, but the music has not. The songs he helped create still matter, they still live, and for many fans, they always will. Thank you for joining me on this deep dive into the rise and fall of REO Speedwagon. Before you go, let me know your thoughts in the comments. Which REO song means the most to you? Which era of the band do you connect with the most? I would love to hear your stories. And if you enjoyed this documentary, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe to Band History so we can keep sharing the stories behind the music that shaped our lives.